On section 1.7 today, multiplication and division of real numbers, so focusing mostly on how to deal with negatives when you're multiplying and dividing. We'll also take into account some of the stuff that we learned yesterday in adding and subtracting, or yesterday and the day before, I should say, adding and subtracting real numbers. And we're spending as much time on this as we are because that's one of the most common problems that people have is making mistakes with negatives and not quite understanding how they work. So if I multiply 5 times negative 3, what that really means is that I'm shortening an addition problem. So this is negative 3 5 times. So negative 3 plus negative 3 plus negative 3 plus negative 3 plus negative 3. So if I am adding negatives, what I know from section 1.5 is that my answer is going to be negative, because if I continue to add a negative, I'm going to go to the left of 0, and that's just going to be negative 3 plus negative 3, which is negative 6, plus negative 3, which is negative 9, plus negative 3, which is negative 12, plus negative 3, which is negative 15. But there's a reason that we multiply instead of writing that out and adding every single time. So if you look at how to actually deal with this, 5 times 3 is 15. So 5 times negative 3 is negative 15. So the rule that we come into contact with, because this is a little bit trickier if we look at part C, negative 10 times negative 10, negative 9 negative 10 times, or negative 10 negative 9 times, is not really as easy to write out like this. What we do know is that if we multiply a negative by a negative, we end up with a positive. So our rule of thumb with multiplication is negative times a negative gives us a positive. Positive times a negative gives us a negative. Negative times a positive gives us a negative. And positive times a positive equals a positive. So if we have the same sign, they're positive. If we have opposite signs, they are negative. So 6 times 3 is 18, because it's negative 3, then it's going to be negative 18. So you multiply the absolute values and then deal with the negatives. Remember, fractions multiplying across, we multiply the top numbers, so 1 times 2 is 2, 5 times 3 is 15. Because this 1/5 is negative, then it's going to be negative 2 over 15. 9 times 10 is 90. And because it's a negative times a negative, this is going to be a positive 90. Part D, negative 372 times 0. Keep in mind that 0 is neither positive nor negative. Anything times 0 is always going to be 0. If you think about this in terms of our addition problem, negative 372 0 times is going to be 0. Or if you look at it the other way, 0 negative 372 times is still going to be 0. If we're multiplying more than two numbers, then you have to look at how many numbers there actually are and how many negatives there actually are. So let's first just work with the absolute values of the numbers. So 3 times 1 is 1. I'm kidding. That's not right. Sorry. 3 times 1 is 3. Times 2 is 6. Times 2 is 12. So I'm going to break that down a little bit. You don't have to show these steps every time, but I do want to make sure everybody knows how this works. So 3 times 1 is 3. Negative times a negative is a positive. I'm going to drop down the 2 and the negative 2. So I'm going at this one step at a time. 3 times 2 is 6. Drop down the negative 2. So 6 times 2 is 12. So because this is a negative, this is going to give me negative 12. And if I look at this, I have 1, 2, 3 negatives. So these two negatives make a positive. But if I multiply a positive times a negative, then I end up with a negative. So my answer should be negative. Now if I look at part B, I'm going to have to write this a little smaller. Negative 1 times negative 2 is a positive 2. I'm going to drop down everything else. This negative 2 times 3 times negative 4. And when I say I'm going to drop it down, I mean I'm just moving it down from first step to the second step because I didn't use it, so I'm rewriting it. So in the next step, 2 times negative 2 is negative 4 because I have a positive times a negative, and 2 times 2 is 4. So negative 4 times 3 times negative 4. 4 times 3 is 12. Since this is a negative 4 times 3, this is going to be negative 12, and I'm going to drop down negative 4. And 4 times 12 is 48. Because it's a negative times a negative, it's a positive 48. So if you look at this back at the beginning, negative times a negative is a positive, times a negative is a negative, times another negative is a positive. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4 negatives. So if I'm multiplying, if I have an odd number of negatives, then it's a negative. If I have an even number of negatives, then it's a positive. Moving on to dividing. Dividing is the same as multiplying by the reciprocal. So the same rules apply in terms of our positives and negatives. Now the reciprocal is the number by which you multiply a number to get 1. So if my number is 5, then my reciprocal is going to be 1 over 5, because if I multiply 5 by 1 over 5, then I multiply, remember, a whole number times a fraction. I'm just multiplying by the top, so this is 5 over 5. Anything divided by itself is 1. So my reciprocal is what I multiply this by to get 1. So this is my reciprocal, 1/5. 1 over 3, I'm going to multiply by 3 over 1. So I'm basically just taking the number and flipping it over. If it's a whole number, I put it under 1. If it's a fraction, I just flip that fraction over. Again, this is because 1 times 3 is 3. 3 times 1 is 3. So I end up with 1. So my reciprocal is 3 over 1, or just 3. You can write it either way. Now if I have a negative number, remember I'm looking to get a positive 1, so my reciprocal also has to be negative. So if it's 4, then my reciprocal is 1 over 4, also needs to be negative, because a negative times a negative gives you a positive. So my reciprocal is negative 1 over 4. And you can double check this, because negative 4 times negative 1 is positive 4 over 4, which gives us 1. So my reciprocal is negative 1/4. And then on the last one, this is going to be negative, and I'm just writing the reciprocal this time. Reciprocal will be negative because my original number is negative, and then I flip that fraction, so it's 5 over 4. That's my reciprocal. This becomes very important when we start solving for x in coming units. So it's important to know that's also called the multiplicative inverse, but I tend to call it the reciprocal. So what the definition of that is whatever you're multiplying by to get 1. And I'm going to continue on with some examples of actually dividing real numbers on the next video, because this one's getting a little bit long. So see you in a moment.